Okay, we're live. Hey guys, welcome back to another poetry lesson with Lindsay O'Connor. I can't express to you how amazingly fortunate I feel to have her instruct us today. And without further ado, I'm going to sort of hand the mic over to her. What are we doing today, Lindsay?
Hey everybody. So last time we talked about Emily Dickinson, and today we're gonna take it into the early 20th century with some poems by Edna St. Vincent Millay, who maybe some of you have heard about, maybe some of you haven't. She's born in 1892. She's like a big part of modernist culture, and she dies in 1950. She's a poet, she's a playwright, she does a little bit of fiction, she has some pseudonyms that she writes under, she's pen names, whole bunch of different stuff. So we're gonna do a couple sonnets from her collection called A Few Figs from Thistles, which was put out in 1920. Some of these poems were also published in Poetry Magazine in 1922, which we might talk a little bit about that moment. So this is A Few Figs from Thistles. There's a whole bunch of lyric poetry, and then at the last four poems are these four sonnets that themselves don't have titles. They're just known by their, I guess, the number or by their first line. I see them as being sort of related to each other. Like when these four sonnets are published later in Poetry Magazine, they're published together. They're distinct. You can take them separately, but I do want to talk a little bit about what might be happening with them together. So we may not get through four of them, but I think we can at least do two. May
I interject with a question here? Is that okay?
Yes.
So I love the fact that you brought up that she wrote under pseudonyms, and I'm kind of curious, A, what pseudonyms she wrote under, what her authorial intent was with doing that, and if these particular poems were written underneath a pseudonym.
Right.
Obviously,
so
interesting.
It's actually funny. I said pseudonym, and I immediately, when it came out of my mouth, I was like, "That's the wrong word." But I because you're talking about Kierkegaard, that's So pen name, I think, would be the word. And I don't have a good. Those might just be terms of art. Like I'm not sure that I have a good sense of like how a pseudonym is different than a pen name, right? I mean, I think with Kierkegaard, like they are these like developed personae in a way, like they are kind of characters, right? Whereas a pen name is just to like hide one's identity, maybe. So no, these are published as her. Like I don't think she ever published any poetry under a pen name. Like I think that was like prose stuff that she did, and it was Nancy something. I forget the name. And so yeah, so that's like some other stuff that I haven't read. And she did some plays too, and I think that those were all also under her name. I'm not entirely sure.
Cool.
Though she did. While we're on the topic of names, her name, like she's named after St. Vincent's Hospital. Like the middle name St. Vincent is from St. Vincent's Hospital, which is like where her mother's brother had recently saved his life or something, like right before she was born. So it's just this kind of reference. But she went by Vincent most of her life. And so like there was a way, like I think that she was sending things in for publication with just V Millay or Vincent or S Vincent, so there was a sort of gender thing happening with how she presented herself, but also how she like on paper, would have tried to get things published. So, but again, I don't know all the details of like which poems and which collections and which publishers had this and that, because she also was very much like a person on the scene. Like she knew a lot of people, like very different than Emily Dickinson. She's definitely not like staying home, and staying in the house. So she is writing a lot of interesting letters, but she has a pretty interesting wildlife, which we can talk about too.
I know this is probably a little tangential. I don't know. I think both you and I are aficionados of indie music. I don't know if you know if the artist St. Vincent is paying homage to Edna St. Vincent Millay. Is she?
It's possible. I don't. I meant to look that up actually. Like it's definitely possible. But yeah, I don't know. And I actually don't know who like St. Vincent as far as like in Catholic hagiography, is that the word? I don't actually know who St. Vincent is. So, but yeah, it seems plausible. So let's start with the first one, and I'm trying to continue a little bit of like what we were doing with Emily Dickinson, not necessarily to pick up any particular themes, but just to continue with this approach, which is allowing me to try to draw some stuff out of Luke and show him that he knows a lot more about poetry than he thinks he does. So
you're my poetic Socrates.
Right. So I want you to read this first of the four sonnets,
right.
if You will.
Okay, I got so humiliated last week tripping over the hyphens in Emily Dickinson.
I'm helping you. This will be it should go better.
All right, for anyone listening, this is a cold read. I have never seen this poem in my entire life. You want the first poem. That's what you want, right?
Yep, the one that starts, yeah, love, and it ends with crave. So, yeah.
Okay. Love, though for this you riddle me with darts and drag me at your chariot till I die. Oh, heavy prince, oh, panderer of hearts, yet hear me tell how in their throats they lie, who shout you mighty, thick about my hair. Day in, day out, your ominous arrows purr, who still am free unto no querulous care. A fool and in no temple worshipper, I that have barred me to your quiver's fire, lifted my face into its puny rain, do wreathe you impotent to evoke desire, as you are powerless to elicit pain. Now will the God for blasphemy so brave punish me surely with the shaft I crave.
Great.
Wow. I can see now that I've heard myself read it and I see the punctuation and everything like that, I made so many mistakes. So I like how you I really like this teaching method because it kind of shows that like anybody can do this. Like if I can like stumble through this and you can use my errors to show everybody like what not to do. This is a really good pedagogical method that you've employed. I like it.
Thanks. The pedagogical method of embarrassment. No, but no. What I want you like to get out of it though is like it's just like when you said that like, you can stumble through it and notice all your errors. It's like well, like that's what that's like if you notice that they're errors, like you're noticing something, right? Like someone who doesn't know anything about poetry would have no idea that you were you know, like how could you know you're stumbling if you didn't have a sense of what was supposed to be there or have some expectation that you're bringing to it, right?
Right. I guess I do know a little bit more than I give myself credit for.
Right. And so tell me about feeling like you stumbled. Like what are spots that you notice?
Aside from my mispronunciation of basic words,
querulous is that's a tough word.
bared, right? Bared is the word, and querulous, right? I think the most notable to me, like when I saw at the end of this poem where there are parentheses, usually when I use parentheses in my own writing, it's like nudge, nudge, wink, wink, let me whisper something in your ear. But then there's like an exclamation point at the end of what is bracketed with the parentheses. So I like started quiet and then I was like, how do I silent shout? I didn't know how to do that.
Okay.
And I think this seems to be kind of a I don't know if the word inordinate, but more than usual use of commas. So it was kind of difficult for me to find the cadence a little bit as a result of that. So I know enough about poetry that when you encounter like punctuation, like exclamation marks and periods and semicolons or and colons and stuff like that be to mark things. But when you have commas when you have so many commas, it was sort of difficult for me to figure out if I should pause at all. I found that to be a little difficult.
Yeah.
So those are the first things that come to mind.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So I do think there's something about. I had actually never thought of it in like precisely as being about comma use or comma use being like a symptom of this, but I do think that there's a weird, this is a very imprecise term, but there's something not very poetic about her poetry, that it's a bit more like these kind of long sentences that have these embedded phrases and stuff in them, that it reads a little bit like, I don't know, when I write a really long sentence in a critical work or something like that. And so to me, that's a little bit of like what's happening with the commas. And the second poem, I think, is even more that way, that there's like this whole offset thing and I don't actually know what it's modifying, and that's an interesting kind of thing to talk about.
It's like Joycean in that respect.
Yeah. But we do also have, you know, oh, heavy prince, oh, panderer of hearts. Like there are these, you know, almost stereotypical sort of poetic moments. So, okay, so that's, I guess I was going to ask you, some things about sound, I guess. And so one of the things is that it sounds like you feel like you didn't quite, that it didn't sound right when you read it. But do you notice like what you think is like supposed to be happening, or what patterns, I suppose, in sound are going on there? Like, and this can be even just looking at it.
Well, that was kind of one of the things and maybe it was just because it was like on camera or whatnot. It was and it was a cold read or whatever. I
didn't set you up for success, but
no, that's fine. I'm not complaining or anything like that. Like, I'm happy to do all sort of like in a public forum, because really I want to invite other people to take a similar sort of risk. So it's not embarrassing or anything like that for me. I think it was a little hard for me to put it all together as far as what was going on in tone and content. I have to say, like, I think I might need to reread it, or maybe listen to you read it, and because I think I was so aware of my mistakes that I don't know if I grasped what's going on in the poem.
Absolutely, totally. Okay, so but I'll read it in just a minute. Let's just talk a little bit about form first, right? So like, and this is really similar to what I was asking you about Dickinson as well. So it's one big rectangle, as I would call it. Like, again, there's none of these super long lines. The lines are roughly the same length, right? Obviously, they're grouped as sonnets. I've been talking about them as sonnets. This is a sonnet, right?
Could you perhaps say something about like precisely what a sonnet is?
Yeah. So there's a sonnet is a 14-line poem. There's a few different forms. There's two main forms. There's the Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean sonnet. These are all Shakespearean sonnets. So a Shakespearean sonnet has 3 quatrains. So a quatrain is a 4-line unit. And so that's your first 12 lines, 3 times 4. And then a couplet at the end. So 2 rhymed lines right at the end. Sonnets generally all in iambic pentameter, right? So here, if you look through, right, darts, hearts, die, lie, right? You have this A-B rhyme scheme. And then lie, you're done there, right? The next quatrain starts, hair, purr, care, worshipper, right? That's a CD, right? Subsequently the same. So, and there's different ways that structure can kind of work. Some people see it as sort of like intensifying all the way through, and then you get this like bang with the couplet at the end. The Petrarchan sonnet has an octet, so 8 lines, and then a sestet, which is 6 lines. Though the octet is generally broken up into 2 quatrains, and they have a slightly different rhyme scheme. So there you get an A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C rhyme scheme. And then the sestet can be weird. There can be 2 tercets, and there's different rhyme schemes that can happen at the end there. But the Petrarchan sonnet usually, like, the reason it's generally broken up into the octet and the sestet is that like something changes between those 2. Like after line 8, there's usually some kind of turn in the content, like in what's being said, in what's going on. Like a conflict is resolved, or a conflict is raised, or like something changes, right, at that point. So you get like more lines through which to resolve or work through or whatever that thing. So that maybe gives you some sense of what the parentheses are about.
So if I can just ask a follow-up question,
yes,
is that the dead giveaway between a Shakespearean sonnet? Well, so all sonnets have 14 lines, and the dead giveaway between a Shakespearean and a Petrarchan, is that the word?
Petrarchan. Mm-hmm.
Is that there's a rhyme couplet at the end of the Shakespearean. I think the thing that would be, is that enough to distinguish between the 2, or do you have to know this sort of like rhyming structure of quatrains and sextets or whatever that you're talking about in terms of the?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like that's a good way to look at it. But like the sonnet is a very old form. The Petrarchan sonnet is from the 13th century, and so there's a long tradition of sonnets, and by now, even by Millay's moment, and certainly by now, like people are messing with those forms. It's not like you have to pick one or the other, right? And like even what I was saying within the Petrarchan form, like those last 6 lines can have slightly different rhyme scheme. So like, yes, I think that the couplet at the end is like a good, that's a good like quick and dirty sort of way to figure it out, but like it may not always be the case. So like if someone should teach you, not me, should teach you, what's it called? Leda and the Swan by Yeats, which is a sonnet that like mixes the two forms very famously, and that's, you know, people read the mixing of the two forms as being a thematic thing for what's going on in the poem and blah, blah, blah. So I don't remember if that poem actually ends with a couplet or not. I think it does. Yeah, so we have the Shakespearean sonnet. And this is interesting too, because Millay goes on to write many more sonnets and sort of sonnet series in her lifetime. And she's not always writing Shakespearean ones. Like later on, she writes some Petrarchan ones, which I actually kind of like a little better. So that should give you a sense of maybe like what to listen for, I guess. And also what to read for, right? So like not all the rhymes are exactly precise. They're not as slanty, I don't think, as Emily Dickinson, but like to think about, I mean, and the poem will do it for you, right? Because there's going to be an emphasis at the end of every line, like that's where the stress is going to fall there. So it's going to like make you really quickly like expect rhyme in certain places, you know. So I'll try to read it again, and like maybe then we can get a little bit more at like what is going on and who's here and all of that kind of stuff.
Awesome.
Good? All right. Okay. Love, though for this you riddle me with darts and drag me at your chariot till I die. Oh, heavy prince, oh, panderer of hearts. Yet hear me tell how in their throats they lie, who shout you mighty. Thick about my hair, day in, day out, your ominous arrows purr, who still am free unto no querulous care a fool and in no temple worshipper. I, that have bared me to your quiver's fire, lifted my face into its puny rain, do wreathe you impotent to evoke desire, as you are powerless to elicit pain. Now will the god, for blasphemy so brave, punish me surely with the shaft I crave.
Okay.
All right.
So I can't tell if she is swearing off love or wants it more than ever.
Exactly. Perfect. Next poem.
Wait, is it just a paradox between those two desires?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's yeah, we call it a paradox. So yeah, I mean, that's exactly what's going on, and like that's what's happening with this turn at the end with these like two lines, I think. Right, is that all through it, the three quatrains to me are all about like screw love, like I am immune from this, like I am pushing it away, like it is trying, but I will not like succumb, you know. So I have bared me to your quiver's fire, right? You know, I read you impotent to evoke desire. I read you powerless, right? Like I am like defeating like this foe, right?
Right.
But then at the end, right, there's this turn, you know. So yes, I mean, I think that that's like the theme. But I guess I also want to get at what might be going on with the direct address. So it starts out, love, though for this you riddle me with darts and drag me to your chariot till I die. Right? It's a direct address to a personified love, right?
Would that be like Eros?
Like Eros, yeah, right. So it has a chariot, he's a prince, right? Arrows, the quiver of arrows, right? Like we have an arrow purring in the quiver, and then the shaft, right, of the arrow, presumably. So, you know, so yeah, we have this Eros Cupid kind of person or god or entity, right? Personified being. I guess I'm interested in that particular direct address here and like what might be going on in this particular moment. And maybe I guess I can just sort of like go on about this rather than like asking you. But so I'm going to take a little bit of a detour. I think so. I guess I just want to set this as who Edna St. Vincent Millay is and what she's up to. And what's going on in 1920, right, in like culture. So she got famous kind of early when she was like 20. She published a poem called Renaissance that was, it's a long poem. It's like 200 lines, and she won a big award for it. And someone decided to like pay for her to go to college. She grew up very poor. So she went to Vassar when she was like 21 and graduated from Vassar. And then she moved to New York City and like moves to Greenwich Village and just like is absorbed in this like World War I and then like 1920s jazz age avant-garde salon culture, right? So she's living this like really interesting wild life. Like she doesn't have a lot of money, but she's like friends with all these artists and all these critics and all these writers, and she's part of this community. And this is also something that, like, to zoom out more, is so like, this is such a huge part of modernism and like what modernism is all about. Like it's about these like, I guess I've always heard it called salon culture, like these like reading groups. So like in Europe, you have like the Bloomsbury group, right? Like that's something that's happening. Like all these people in England who are like, this is Virginia Woolf is part of this, right? And there's also, to connect to your things, or some of the stuff I hope we talk about, right? Like, you know, Bertrand Russell is in that world, right? Even Wittgenstein, while not in that world, is like writing at this particular time. You know, that there's like philosophers and stuff who are like a G. Moore, I think, is around them. So in Europe, you've got Bloomsbury, then you've got, like, if you've seen Midnight in Paris, right, you have all these expats who are in Paris in the 20s. But in the US, you have Greenwich Village, and you have the Bowery, you have people doing all kinds of avant-garde stuff there, right? And I mentioned that, I guess, as like an interesting modernist thing because it gets to interdisciplinarity, or like art that's, you know, that's across, or multimedia art or whatever, people who are working in different genres and working friends across, you know, like painters are friends with writers and all that kind of stuff. But also to contrast to some like big moments before, so that Victorian writing doesn't really have that with it, that like the Romantic poets, which you've learned a lot about, some of this, you know, there are a few of them who are friends, but there's this sense of like the poetry is just like coming out of me, that it's what is it? The Keats thing, it's like emotion recollected in tranquility or something like that. That's the poetic voice, right? Whereas modernism is much more like, it's not connected to the entire community, but to like specific artistic communities, right? So that's the kind of world that Millay is living in. This is also a sort of early feminist moment. If you think the jazz age, 1920s, flappers, bob haircut, whatever, she's often pictured that way. The new woman. So there is a bit more, there is like some pushing against traditional femininity, domesticity, all that kind of stuff, right? And so I want to situate this poem in particular in relation to that, I think, right? That is this like, screw love, I don't care about it. Like I am immune, like I don't need that in my life. And like, it's, you know, and that like love is a wound, that love is like an attack, right? It's like, there's something bad that like you don't want, right? But then you do, right? At the end, it's like, what? And so that she's like positioning herself like in that, like, because that's a thing at this moment, right? It's never as simple. And like, this is part of why I like her. And I'm like, oh, we need to like go back to Millay like today. Is that like, in a way, like nothing has changed. That like, there is this, you know, like the Madonna whore paradox or whatever, or like dichotomy still exists, you know, like right. You still need to be a good, proper buttoned up person. And you also need to be sexy, and you also need to be promiscuous. Like that all these things, like, you know, somehow are demanded of women, right? And so there's like, it's not exactly performing that, but I think it is like working through a like wanting to resist the trappings of like traditional femininity and romance, right? But and also by extension, like poetry, right? That like it's resisting a kind of like in the form of a very traditional form of a Shakespearean sonnet, right? Which like they're called Shakespeare, you know, we know all the Shakespearean sonnets are like all these like things about love, right? People recite them on Valentine's Day and all that kind of stuff. Like in that form, you know, she's addressing love. Eros was his Cupid's arrow, like how traditional, you know, like we've seen this a zillion times. But she's pushing it, you know, she's pushing it away. She's saying, I don't want that, right? So like in this really traditional form, she's like doing something else. What else was I gonna say about that? Oh, so yeah, I guess, and to go back to the historical moment, I guess. So this work I mentioned to you off camera, A Few Figs from Thistles, 1920-ish, is definitely like not considered her best work. At the time, it got kind of mixed reviews, I think, and she produced a lot of poetry in the early 20s. So in like, I think it's like 1923 that she puts out Second April, and that is seen as much more mature and interesting, and like that's like the book that in the poetry in the book is like what people think is really good.
What were some of the criticisms of this work, and do you feel like any of them were justified?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I was going to like ask you, but was just like, do you like, what is your sense of this poem, and like, is it any good? Which is like not a question I would normally ask, because I think that that's sort of like not what we're after. Like, I'm not at like, this is really good and this is really bad. And, yeah. But I think that like the sort of, my guess is that this is seen as like a little bit immature because it's kind of playful. Like this isn't like, I mean, I do think like these, oftentimes these like very playful things are getting at very deep contradictions, right? Yeah. But, and that's obviously like the case I'm trying to make for it. But that's my sense of it, is that this is seen as sort of immature and like not as complex. And like, so her first, that poem that was so, that got the award and all that kind of stuff was like very heady. Like it was about transcendence and about humanity's place in the world and like the individual. It's like all these big things, you know? And so then to be like writing some like Shakespearean sonnets. But the other thing I want to get at though about the like kind of longer like historical sense that like this isn't her best work, right? I think in large part is that she's writing in these traditional forms, like, because like soon after, like, so by the 1930s even, she's like kind of out of fashion. And that's this huge change in literary culture. Like high modernism, like this is 1920, like 1922 is like the year for modernism, right? Like that's when The Wasteland comes out. That's when Ulysses comes out. And like the Tractatus comes out actually that year, which is interesting. So by the late 20s and 30s, like modernism is about like weird, obscure stuff, right? It's, I shore these fragments against my ruins. It is like, you need to have a, like, it's going to be really difficult. Like there is work to understand what's going on, and you're not going to get all of it, right? Like these poems are not that, right? These are like, even though she in like content, I would say is like, you know, pushing against these traditional things and all that kind of stuff, like you get what's going on, right?
So is it seen as a kind of a slight that she didn't purposely make things confusing, that she doesn't like engage in some sort of obfuscation that like other modernist poets?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, I don't know if it's like seen as like, I don't know, like it's, I can't account for like what's trendy, you know? I think that it was just out of fashion. But I do think that her later, you know, her later stuff, I mean, I don't know, she's still like, she continues to work in like traditional verse forms at a time when that's not usually what's going on, when free verse is having a moment. And so, but now, like, also, like, there's so many poets today that are going back to traditional forms too, you know, like the Sestina, like, really has had a moment in the, you know, in our lifetime, like, which is like a very difficult form to write, for instance. And that's happening globally, it's not just in the US. So I don't have like a great sense of like, this is when this form is like cool and then it's not, and then, you know, but I do get the sense that like she was in this early modernist moment. It was very much part of this modernist culture. And like part of why I bring all that up is to say like she was friends with all these people, but that she kind of like fell out of fashion or whatever. What else was I going to say? Modernism, slang culture, the avant-garde, the new woman, sonnet.
Well, I'll say this, like, while you consult your notes there, is that I don't find it to be an immature poem. Like, certainly there have been countless songs, countless poems, countless novels, everything written by love, but are written about love. But I mean, that doesn't mean that it can't still be perplexing and there can't be some profundity to it. And it sounds like, with all the background that you gave to it, that it's actually a very mature approach to the subject.
Absolutely. And so I think, and I also think it's like, not everything has to be super serious all the time. It's like, if we have, like, if you just consider like The Wasteland is like hanging over us, right? Like, true. You know, so like, I'm trying to think of like a musical connection or something like that would work here. Like, you know, like if like everyone thinks like Sugar Rose is amazing, right? Like that's the wasteland, you know, like,
right.
You know,
in a Blink-182 world that has just encountered Sigur Rós.
Right. Yeah. Or like even you know, what's like a really good, I'm trying to think of something like an Adele song or something, right? Which are very good. Like I think Adele is great, but like there's something that you can't, you know, like the cool kids are gonna go to the Sigur Rós show, right? So maybe that's like a connection.
Yeah. Well, I have my own personally. I find Adele's music more interesting than Sigur Rós, but that's the crotchety old music producer in me. Actually,
I should know better than to. I'm trying to relate to you, but I'm going to get it wrong. So yeah. Okay, so the other like. I mean, do we need to talk about the last line? Which, like, you know, I feel like in what I'm teaching, I'm always like, "There's the sex thing," and I'm like too happy about it. But
I mean, I would say we can talk about what's necessary to talk about. I mean, I don't really find sex stuff to be all that shocking.
Oh, no.
But perhaps it was shocking at that time.
Yes. Well, no, I don't know. Well, okay. So I do think that there is, and part of why, in some ways, like part of why I like some of her later sonnets better is that like she's talking about like one night stands, like very clearly, like she's talking about things that you just do not expect a female poet, you know, even in the like roaring 20s or whatever, to be talking about so explicitly. I think like in connected to all of her other stuff, it's like kind of a piece. But what I wanted to get at, I guess, is like what's, you know, this thing with the direct address to love, which I brought up, you know, like 20 minutes ago. That is, you know, this very traditional thing, like I'm apostrophizing love, this God, and I'm personifying as all of these really traditional things that we recognize, right? Pandora of Hearts and the, you know, arrows and stuff, right? But I just think, like, I'm wondering a little bit, like, because we could also apostrophize love as, like, your lover, right? Like, you call someone love.
Oh, of course.
Right? And so, like, at least at the start, like, there's a little bit of ambiguity with what's going on there. And both of those are, like, very traditional overdone things, right? So love, though for this you riddle me with darts and drag me at your chariot till I die, you know, like, it could be... Like, to me, it very quickly becomes like the personification of love, the concept, the God, whatever. But it could also be a particular person. And the reason I bring that up is because at the end, right, like that's what I think is interesting about, now will the God for blasphemy so brave punish me, surely with the shaft I crave, right, is like, shoot me with the arrow is like what is like continuous, you know, the meaning of, you know, punish me with the shaft I crave is what is continuous with the rest of the poem, right? Yeah. But there is that little bit of ambiguity, right? Because it doesn't say the God will shoot me with the arrow, right? It says the God will punish me surely with the shaft I crave, right?
Right. It's working on a couple levels, yeah.
Right, and you know, so like there's this way in which like the word love is working on multiple levels, or you know, asking to you know, finally have sex with somebody. So.
Can I ask a formal question?
Yeah.
So, like the Emily Dickinson, what I'm noticing here is that there is capitalization in an unusual place,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's noticeable non-capitalization with God.
Mm-hmm. I don't have a whole lot to offer. I mean, it's pretty traditional for the God, when there are multiple gods, not to be capitalized. Like that's standard, right? So that doesn't actually strike me. But yeah, we have powerless to elicit pain and evoke desire, right? Those are really the only unusual capitalizations, right?
Why do you think she does it?
I don't know. I also wonder, you know, like I'm looking at this not in its like most, I don't know, it's like rendered in a different form. I have to see if I have another one. Yeah, the other one I'm looking at also has it the same way. Potent to evoke desire, you are powerless to elicit pain. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I don't have a sense of like any like tradition around those things. So, I mean, I think like, my like initial reaction is that like it emphasizes the like phallic imagery, right? Or like it kind of like helps set up the final ambiguity or the final like almost joke, if you want to call that, with impotent, powerless. But I still don't know. It doesn't quite cover it because of eliciting pain and evoking desire. So yeah, open to possibilities.
Something I noticed about our I'm echoing. So we may want to tie a bow.
Got it. Okay, well, I was going to go on to the next poem, which would make a little bit more sense with a little bit more history. Let me... Yeah. I guess, I mean, maybe I just want to look forward to possibly doing some of the subsequent poems and see this one as just sort of set this up not as a final, like this does obviously have this like concluding final line, and that's like what happens with the Shakespearean sonnet with the couplet at the end, right? But I do want to think about it in relationship to the next poems that are coming, and so maybe we kind of leave it open to think about this introduction to this particular speaker's relationship to love as a concept, as an experience, and maybe a particular person, maybe not, but that this is our introduction to this particular speaker and their particular situation, and then we will go on to some of the subsequent sonnets from there.
Sounds good. All right, thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks.